Hello and welcome, everybody. Started the meeting just a couple minutes early, so we're just going to wait until noon to start. But welcome, familiarize yourselves with the Q&A and the chat functions. Well, it's noon, so I think we should get started. Hello and welcome to this Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society Northern and Southern Alberta Chapter's Forestry webinar series. Thank you so much for joining. Today's webinar, A Future for Alberta's Mountain Caribou, is going to be presented by myself, Tara Russell. I'm the Program Director with the CPAWS Northern Alberta Chapter, and Kirby Smith, who is joining us. Kirby is a retired wildlife biologist with 32 years of experience working in the region, and we'll be speaking today, is of the region we're speaking about today, and is a member of the Conservation Affairs Committee with the Alberta Chapter of the Wildlife Society. Both Kirby and myself have been engaged in the land use planning process for Alberta's Southern Mountain Caribou since around 2019. Before we get started, I did want to acknowledge that all of the conservation work undertaken by CPAWS all across Alberta occurs on Indigenous lands. CPAWS Northern Alberta, where I work and is in the same area that I live, is on Treaty 6 territory and the Otipemisiwak government for Edmonton and Edmonton Whitemud Métis districts. Our work at CPAWS Northern Alberta takes place across more than the areas that we currently are located, and it occurs across the territories of Treaty 6, 7, 8, and 10. These lands are traditional gathering places for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Neheya, Cree, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Stoney, Dene, and Anishinaabe, Saulteaux. The stewardship of from these people of the lands and waters and resources has shaped our work through partnerships and through leadership. As you may have noticed, you can introduce yourselves in the chat. Please feel free to use that function. I believe we have Laura here from our CPAWS Southern Alberta Chapter helping facilitate and answering questions. You'll see her in the chat as well. I see Josh has introduced our Q&A function and will be keeping tabs on that. So please, if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A and not the chat function. Otherwise, they will get lost. You can also, I believe, like and upvote different questions for the period at the end. So these webinar series are hosted by CPAWS Northern and Southern Alberta, and we have been alternating hosting them about quarterly. Today I'm joining you with the CPAWS Northern Alberta Chapter. We're a nonprofit charitable conservation organization dedicated to the protection and conservation of public lands and waters for the benefit of people and wildlife. We have independent chapters that are run and managed across the country. Like I mentioned, we have two in Alberta. Our Southern Alberta chapter is located in Calgary and our Northern Alberta chapter in Edmonton. So the intent of the webinar today is to discuss the future of Southern Mountain Caribou across Alberta. This has been spurred by the release of the Upper Smoky Sub-Regional Plan draft by the Government of Alberta, which purported to provide plans to recover two of the three remaining southern mountain caribou populations on provincial lands. This is the Red Rock, Prairie Creek, and Narroway caribou herds or populations. The populations of these caribou and the distributions have been shrinking for years, and we wanted to provide some background as well as share our new report, the implications of this plan. So I'm going to pass it over to Kirby to provide an overview of the state of southern mountain caribou.
Thank you, Tara. So this may be redundant for many of you. I don't know all who's on the call, but I thought for people who haven't had experience or knowledge about woodland caribou and mountain caribou, that I'd kind of go over the basics. Next slide, please. So there's two ecotypes in Alberta. In the highlighted area to the bottom of the map is the area that we'll be talking about today. There's two behavioral types of mountain caribou, ones that migrate out to forested winter range and then back into alpine to summer. And then within those groups are animals that choose to stay in the forest during the summer and ones that choose to stay in the mountains during the winter. Next slide, please. So this black line basically demarcates the difference, or the areas that are to the southwest, or the bottom left-hand side would be the mountain caribou range, and all the other ranges to the northeast are the boreal caribou ranges within Alberta. So the boreal ecotype occur in a patchy distribution in northern Alberta. Some of them are migratory and some of them are sedentary. Their migrations, though, would simply be pulsing out from a winter range area and then moving back in, so not an elevational gradient like the mountain caribou. And they tend to rely on fens and muskegs as their primary habitat, where many of the upland sites in the boreal are aspen dominated and not suitable for caribou. Next slide. This shows an area in the Little Smoky herd, which is the most southwesterly boreal herd in the province, and shows well sites, roads, seismic lines, going from upland areas of pine and spruce and down into black spruce bogs. Next. So this was data from the original study that began in 1979, and it shows the yellow is the alopesh herd that winters out along Highway 40 and moves into the north end of Jasper Park and into Wilmore Wilderness to summer. The blue herd is the boreal or Little Smoky herd, which I mentioned is the only boreal herd in west central Alberta. And then the red is the Red Rock Prairie Creek herd, which again moves into the Kakwa, the top end of the Wilmore, and already into British Columbia to summer, and then winters out traditionally on forested winter range, which is part of the Upper Smoky Sub-Regional Plan. So caribou are adapted to snow. This is one of their great benefits in terms of being able to avoid predators. They've got cloven hooves that allow them to be fairly mobile in deep snow. And the next slide. And here's a map that shows some of the original VHF color data, the red being, in this case, the alopesh herd, the green, the Red Rock Prairie Creek herd, and the blue, the Little Smoky. And this shows the depth, changes in snow depth on average throughout the winter. If it was barometric pressure, they'd be isobars. These are, I like to call them isoflakes, but it shows that caribou tend to focus on deeper snow areas to their advantage in terms of predator avoidance. Next slide. So in West Central Alberta, caribou have a strategy of living at low density over large areas. So if you're a predator trying to make a living on on woodland caribou or mountain caribou, you have to travel quite a distance in between groups, and it's not as successful as going after other prey such as moose, elk, or deer. An old caribou biologist by the name of Tom Bergerud coined the phrase "lost in space" after the Star Wars or Star Trek term, and that's kind of how caribou have evolved to avoid predation over the last 10,000 years since the Wisconsin Ice Age. So as I mentioned before, southern mountain caribou, summer in the alpine and winter in the forested foothills, and these two pictures show the difference. So under these old forests of conifers, there's terrestrial lichens that grow on the forest floor, and they're primarily in the Cladina, Cladonia, Cetera, and Stereocolumn genus, and they are the mainstay of caribou diet during the winter. There are lichens that also grow in the alpine, but aren't as thick or as well defined. But they seem to be able to make a good living on lichens combined with many other species that they enjoy in the summer. And I've handled probably 100 female caribou, and I've never run into a skinny caribou. They're always seem to be well fed and fat. So I don't think food is limiting currently. Now, they also use arboreal lichens. Now, arboreal lichens are the mainstay of caribou in British Columbia, where the snow depths are much greater. And caribou in British Columbia go up through the canopy as the snow increases in depths and are able to access arboreal lichens much higher in the canopy. This is Pteris garupa in this picture on the left, picking arboreal lichens in the Red Rock Prairie Creek Range. And arboreal lichens seem to be particularly important in the spring when the snow gets a real crust on it in the daytime or following the daytime thaw and then freezes at night. And I've seen caribou in the morning standing on top of the snowpack at this time of year, and then by the afternoon they're sinking through. So they don't want to move very far during that time, and they don't want to spend a lot of energy pawing when the snow is crusty. So I think that's what tends to drive them to use more arboreal lichens for 2 or 3 weeks in the spring. And often you can find arboreal lichens on the edge of muskegs along black spruce kind of ecotype or ecotone, and also on white spruce and Engelmann spruce in some higher elevations. So it's difficult to do conventional aerial surveys to count caribou because living in these old coniferous forests, sometimes it's often even difficult to see the forest floor. So to track trends, what the Alberta Fish and Wildlife turned to in the early 80s was to try and get a sample of adult females that would be radio collared, and there was 2 advantages to this. One is that you could use the radio collars to come back and count other caribou that are associated with that radio collared animal and get a better minimum estimate. And the second thing is that the radio collars provided get a gauge of survival. In other words, if you had 10 collars out and you lost one, then you had 90% survival. So the next part of this method of determining trend is to compare the calf-cow ratios in late winter when you can still find caribou with a snow background to help you see the animals, and compare it to the mortality of cows over that same time period. So essentially 50% of calves are male and 50% are female. And so if you have lost 10% of your adult females, you'd need to at least have 20 calves per 100 cows, of which 10 of those would be female calves to help replace the adult females that have been lost. So it's basically the balancing of recruitment. And the term used for this calculation is called lambda, or population increase. So this shows essentially a comparison of how many cows you can lose versus how many calves you have to have in order to balance the population on a yearly basis. And on average, calf cow ratios prior to wolf control was about 0.28. And you can see from this diagram that that would require that you'd have to have at least 89% survival in order to achieve a lambda, or balancing the population at 1. So there's been quite a bit of research in Alberta, and certainly a lot in West Central Alberta. The national, or the Canada Recovery Program for caribou has probably a very high percentage of research that has come out of Alberta. We've been blessed with a lot of excellent work. We know that in the Red Rock Prairie Creek herd back by 2000, that animals were avoiding logging areas, and that their daily movements were reduced and their home ranges reduced during the harvest process. They tended to avoid cut blocks the majority of the time, based on a bunch of ground tracking that Darren Stepaniak did. And they seem to also avoid active roads, and to a lesser extent inactive roads. There's been a much more research since then that have compared the population's trends and compared it to land use activities in these areas. So some of the early work in Alberta looked at 6 different herds and compared this basically lambda, whether the population was increasing or decreasing, and then compared it to land use anthropogenic activities, such as oil and gas development, timber harvest, and also natural disturbance such as fire. And basically the correlation showed that you had to have at least 65% of undisturbed habitat to ensure that caribou would continue to thrive in a certain area. Then this formula was actually applied across Canada, with as many herds where there was data on adult female survival and calf-cow ratios, and also through satellite imagery information on land use activities and fire. And the formula held up, so it's quite a robust piece of research, and it's formed the basis for the Canadian Recovery Program, which again tries to achieve a 65% undisturbed for habitat within each range. This, however, only gives you about a 60% guarantee that the population will continue to thrive, but most herds in Alberta are well below this. So the root problem here, I mean, the ultimate issue is habitat, but the proximal cause of mortality in caribou is often predation. And so this slide basically tries to explain that the issue is, if you take an old forest that has low densities of moose, elk, and deer, which are prey of wolves, and you turn it into a young forest, the food that results, or the vegetation that results from this, favors moose, elk, and deer over caribou. And so these other species increase in density. And with an increase in density of the species, these alternate prey, wolves also increase. I think we missed a slide there. Oh. The next slide that'll come up hopefully will be one showing that if you have more wolves, a higher density of wolves, then you're going to have more wolves means less caribou. And so the term that's been coined for this is apparent competition. So moose, elk, and deer aren't competing directly with caribou for food. or for space for that matter, but by virtue of their presence and an increase in density based on anthropogenic change through logging and through oil and gas development, it results in a higher density of wolves, and caribou are the losers. Like I mentioned, handling caribou. I've never been afraid of being injured by a caribou. They just basically want to get away. But you can contrast that with even a yearling white-tailed deer will strike at you with their little sharp hooves and can rip your jacket in half. So I think that's why caribou don't do well with wolves. So the provincial government has yet to do anything about habitat. The amount of habitat that's disturbed remains the same or increases. There's been no sincere attempt to start to heal the landscape up other than to restore some legacy seismic lines, which at the rate that's going on, I think people have said that it may take 200 or 300 years to do that at the rate it's happening. What really needs to happen is to allow for more intact forest to exist, particularly in West Central Alberta. Wolf control has been ongoing in the Little Smoky since 2006, and now I think there are about 8 different herds where wolf control is occurring. And also there's been a increase in the harvest of moose, because if you release moose from predation, then they're going to increase dramatically as well, and you just get an explosion of moose, which would mean that you'd have to even kill more wolves. The issue in West Central Alberta is that lichens tend to grow at in forests that are 80 years or older, and those are also the same forests that are targeted by timber companies. But going back to the 65% disturbed, if you do the simple math and you have a 100-year rotation of forest harvest, at any one time there's only 20% of it that's older than 80. And so that's the essential issue here in for the mountain caribou range on the winter range, is because this overlap in what we want to happen on the landscape. So you can't have it all in the same space. So this has gone back. Well, I started collaring caribou in 1979. Hunting was closed in 81. The caribou provincially were first designated as threatened in 1986. It was reconfirmed in 2001. There was a provincial recovery plan completed in 2004. There was an Alberta Caribou Committee formed in 2005. I was seconded to write up a landscape plan for all 4 herds in West Central Alberta in 2008, but that never got any traction within the government. And then the provincial woodland caribou policy was released in June 2011. And I'm going to turn it over to Tara to talk about what has happened since then.
Thank you so much, Kirby, for sharing all of that. Hopefully everyone can see me now. As Kirby mentioned, a lot has gone on to attempt to address caribou recovery issues, and it didn't stop with the woodland caribou policy for Alberta. In 2014, there was a federal recovery strategy released, and subsequently, since then, there has been continued habitat disturbance and continued industrial development within the ranges of both the Red Rock Prairie Creek and Narroway caribou populations, winter ranges, and to some extent, some of their summer ranges as well. In 2018, the Government of Canada completed an imminent threat assessment that did find that these 2 caribou populations were facing imminent threats to the recovery, and noted the need for immediate intervention to be required to allow for eventual recovery. This kind of spurred a Section 11 conservation agreement between Alberta and Canada, where it was agreed that Alberta would produce 11 sub-regional plans to recover the 15 caribou populations on provincial lands, which did include the Red Rock Prairie Creek and Narroway herds. Since then, only 2 plans have been finalized, the Bistro Lake and the Cold Lake plans, but the Upper Smoky Sub-Regional Plan, which does cover the Red Rock Prairie Creek and Narroway caribou populations, was released in draft in March of 2025, so just recently. And this has really spurred a lot of our concerns around the outcomes for these 2 caribou populations. The intent of these sub-regional plans really was to plan for the habitat restoration and to meet the necessary habitat requirements for caribou recovery. So as Kirby mentioned, 65% undisturbed habitat, as well as that old coniferous forest known as the biophysical habitat that the caribou require to carry out their life processes. These sub-regional plans really, in my view, were meant to be an opportunity for caribou, which we are losing from this landscape. So the draft plan that was released in March was, in our opinion, profoundly disappointing. I think it was a lost opportunity to meaningfully recover caribou populations and plan for a future where they have the landscapes they need to survive. There were a handful of redeeming features in the plan, such as the proposal for new conservation areas in caribou summer habitat, but fundamentally, our concerns are that it'll fail to keep caribou on the landscape. In response to the concerns of this plan, CPAWS Northern Alberta, the Alberta Wilderness Association, and the Alberta Chapter of the Wildlife Society put forward a report, which we released in April, highlighting the implications mostly of the areas permitted for timber harvest within the draft plan for caribou recovery. Unfortunately, the timber cutting and oil and gas provisions outlined in the sub-regional plan are not going to provide adequate areas for caribou that are undisturbed by human development. And by failing to do so, the sub-regional plan is not going to conserve or recover the Red Rock Prairie Creek or Narroway caribou populations and will risk their extirpation. So throughout this plan, I'm really grateful to our GIS analysts on our team who went through and mapped out spatially some of the implications from the timber harvest scenarios put forward in the plan, and I'm going to run through some of those with you all right now. So this figure here shows habitat disturbance within the Red Rock Prairie Creek winter range and the Narroway winter range as of 2021 using the ABMI human footprint. This is only mapping the long-lasting industrial features, including the roads, pipelines, power lines, and timber harvest cut blocks. And I do want to note that it does not map the seismic exploration lines to really give you an idea of the opportunities for recovery of biophysical habitat within the range. It's important to note, I think as Kirby did, again, that neither winter range for these caribou meet the minimum requirements for 65% undisturbed habitat. And that also, this map is disturbance as of 2021, where human footprint in the range has undoubtedly continued. The oil and gas development features within the range are relatively small in size. Their primary impact for caribou is really that creation of habitat disturbance, which does result in a reduction in the undisturbed critical habitat available for both caribou populations. But this is in contrast with the high impact that timber harvesting can have to both the undisturbed area, but again, that biophysical critical habitat that they need. About half of the Narroway winter range is covered by harvest blocks, and extensive harvesting has taken place across the Red Rock Prairie Creek winter range as well. I just got a note, Fiona, saying not seeing the right slide. Are you seeing like brown splotches around the outside of the caribou range, Fiona? Okay, I'll carry on. Folks are saying it looks right. Thank you for that check-in. So I think as Kirby mentioned with the timber harvest, um, the rotation is that none of the timber harvesting blocks depicted in this figure contain any of that 80-plus-year-old regrowth, which is the minimum age for the onset of biophysical critical habitat. And again, this figure depicts harvest up until 2021, which has continued since then in the past 4 years. The ongoing disturbance within both caribou winter ranges has caused a decline in population, but it also is most evidently causing a decline in distribution across the winter range. This figure here depicts the caribou locations recorded from radio telemetry monitoring from before 2014. We chose that date because it coincides with the release of the federal recovery strategy for southern mountain caribou. This figure displays the radio telemetry monitoring data from 2014 to present day. The distribution of the Red Rock, Prairie Creek, and Narroway caribou has collapsed in face of ongoing habitat loss and disturbance within the winter ranges, with both populations being increasingly restricted to the mountain summer ranges on a year-round basis. There has been a very clearly documented distribution decline for the Red Rock Prairie Creek population, and the retreat of these caribou from their forested winter range in the mountains has coincided with increasing habitat loss and disturbance across their forested winter range. And as Kirby mentioned, caribou wintering in the mountains have lower survival in comparison to caribou that migrate to the remaining critical habitat in the forested foothills winter range. I wanted to throw these figures up side by side because although the population levels for these caribou populations have stabilized due to wolf culling, you can manage wolves as a threat to caribou populations, but when they're forced to spend time in the alpine during the winter, you cannot protect the caribou from avalanches. So two avalanches in the winter of 2017-2018 killed 26 caribou in the Red Rock Prairie Creek population, and again in 2019, avalanches killed a significant portion of the Red Rock Prairie Creek caribou population. I want to also mention that avalanches were the final cause of the loss of the Banff caribou populations, and again, are not something that can be managed through intensive interventions. So that was really good context setting to address our concerns over the proposed and planned timber harvest that was put out in the draft plan. Weyerhaeuser is an American-owned forestry company that is the primary tenure holder within the entire Upper Smoky Sub-Regional Planning area. And the entire forested foothills winter range of both the Red Rock Prairie Creek and Narroway populations are fully contained within Weyerhaeuser's tenure. I think this highlights an opportunity and a responsibility that the land use plan had to redefine forest management permissions in the region and really enable the full recovery of winter range for these caribou populations. Unfortunately, this opportunity is going to be squandered if the timber harvest in the draft plan does move ahead. This figure here depicts the full sequence proposed in the sub-regional plan for the timber harvesting across the two caribou winter ranges. And then on top of that, with the cut blocks that were existing in 2021. It's really important to note the first 3 decades of proposed timber harvest are the ones with a bit of a darker outline. And we specifically highlighted the first 3 decades of the proposed harvest here, overlapping it with the caribou occupancy and movement trends from the post-2014 radio telemetry monitoring for caribou. And the negative implications of the proposed timber cutting plan can be really seen here. So that first 25 years of timber cutting in the Caribou winter ranges would almost entirely overlap with the remaining occurrence and movements of caribou in their winter range, and leaves a really small area of unharvested forest that caribou would almost certainly avoid due to that high predation risk. So these first 3 decades of timber cutting would almost eliminate the ability of both caribou populations to exist in the winter ranges. So as Kirby noted, it's important for caribou to have both undisturbed critical habitat as well as biophysical critical habitat. And both of those goals should have been made an objective in the draft sub-regional plan. The biophysical habitat is that old coniferous forest in the range with conifer stands over 80 years of age, and the undisturbed are areas, including a 500-meter buffer on human-caused disturbances that are over 40 years, and the caribou require both to survive and recover. The impacts of the timber harvest are specifically really consequential for biophysical habitat within the range. So that timber harvest described for the Red Rock Prairie Creek winter range would dramatically decrease the available biophysical habitat for the Red Rock Prairie Creek caribou, and may leave some isolated patches that wouldn't contribute to caribou persistence. This was an estimate of the impact of that proposed forest harvest sequence over the next 100 or so years. And we can see that the proportion of available biophysical habitat, again, dramatically declines. It'll be very unlikely that caribou will be able to survive this. This is the same estimate for the narrow-way population. It's not quite as dramatic, but it still leaves them very, very little habitat with which to persist. Excuse me. We're also very concerned about the impacts of the proposed forest harvest on undisturbed habitat. Our GIS analyst, my colleagues, mapped the remaining patches of undisturbed critical habitat that are greater than 1,000 hectares. And again, I will note that this does not include seismic lines because of their intention to be restored. The draft sub-regional plan did not initially provide a projection of undisturbed critical habitat for caribou, but it does seem that ecologically meaningful recovery of undisturbed habitat over the next 25 years is not credible. There have since been supplemental materials provided by the Government of Alberta after the draft plan was released, and as well after the publication of our joint report that indicate that the minimum habitat requirements of 65% in winter range are unlikely to be met within the first 100 years. So our conclusions are that as currently written, the draft Upper Smoky Sub-Regional Plan would perpetuate and intensify the very conditions that led to the endangerment of both of these caribou populations. And to be effective, the sub-regional plan has to address the root cause of caribou decline, that ongoing critical habitat destruction. The Upper Smoky draft sub-regional plan, again, is a really big missed opportunity to address that root cause of caribou extirpation. But it is a draft, and there is a lot of opportunity still to provide feedback. Which brings me to one of our last slides, which is what can you do? Both CPAWS, the Alberta Chapter of the Wildlife Society, Nature Alberta, and the Alberta Wilderness Association have put together an engagement guide highlighting some of our thoughts and opinions to help the public answer the Government of Alberta's public survey As well, we have a blog and other resources, and of course, the report that we just presented today to help inform any feedback that you do have. It does seem like the Government of Alberta planning team is really keen on hearing feedback and has really emphasized repeatedly that it means a lot if folks fill out the survey or send emails to the engagement email. So I've included a QR code here, both to our engagement guide as well to directly to the Government of Alberta public survey. I will also ask Josh or Laura, if you're here, to maybe put a link to our report and our blog into the chat for folks. But with that is the conclusion of our presentation today, and Kirby and I are both really happy to take questions with the remaining time that we have.
Thank you so much, Kirby and Tara. Just a note for the questions, if you can write them ideally in the Q&A section, we can answer them as we go from there. And I see you've got the first question here, so I'll put this to the two of you. And this is from Mark Finney, and the question is there any evidence to indicate whether caribou will make use of high retention forestry cut blocks? For example, leaving 30 to 70% forest cover post-harvest in strips or scattered trees. So would that be a way for caribou to still use cut areas?
I'll take a crack at that. So yes, there's some work that's been done along Highway 40, looking at partial cut, and I actually presented to the Upper Smoky planning team a proposal to examine that. The advantage is that after it'll be now like 25 or 26 years post logging, that the lichens are still present. The original idea was that by opening up the forest, mosses would decline and lichens would reinvade the sites that the mosses had left. The mosses have declined, but the lichens don't seem to have expanded, but they've remained. So here's a case where up to 90% of the timber value could be removed and still have lichens. Unfortunately, if you do that and still provide roads, which you have to get access to timber, if caribou do use it, they still do it at their peril because of the response by alternate prey, such as moose, elk, and deer in adjoining areas. So right now, I think the Red Rock, Prairie Creek, and Narrowway ranges are so impacted that we need to back off timber harvest to a very large degree, much larger than what was proposed. And I thought it was a bit disingenuous for the government to only provide one option, which was full-on clear cutting of the winter range. We know from the government that there was alternate scenarios that were examined, but were not provided to the public. So I don't think that's quite fair, and I don't think that's a good way of getting public input into a proposed plan.
Thanks, Kirby. Next question is from Ben Bablitz, and he asks, what are your estimations for the caribou in Jasper Park after the fire? So a related nearby herd. And that's probably for Kirby too.
Yeah, I think Jasper Park is an example of what happens when caribou no longer migrate. The Maligne herd and the Brazou herd, the Maligne herd is gone, and the Brazou herd was down to a dozen animals last I checked, and I think they've been captured and put in the rearing facility. So the other issue in Jasper, people probably don't understand that there was predator control up until about 1950, and then there was a bunch of elk actually reintroduced in about 1920, and so that population of elk exploded and created a lot of wolf packs, I think, that started going up these valleys. And one of the recommendations for the Maligne herd was to shut the Maligne Lake Road down during winter so that wolves couldn't access the alpine, which was what was left of year-round range for the Maligne herd. That didn't happen, and the result is the population is gone. So that's what we don't want to happen to the Red Rock, Prairie Creek, and Narway herds, where they're restricted to using only alpine as summer and winter range. We know that that forage isn't as good in the alpine, and as Tara mentioned, there's the issue with avalanches. So I'm not sure if that answered the question effectively, but that's the segue between the two.
Thanks, Kirby. I'd really encourage folks to use this time to ask some questions of Kirby and Tara. They both have a wealth of experience on this, so don't be shy. Go ahead and ask your questions. And while we wait for some more to come in, I have one for both Tara and Kirby. And that's that you'd mentioned that the Alberta government and the federal government had signed an agreement about recovering caribou. But what you've presented here today seems to suggest that what's being proposed in Alberta won't be able to recover caribou. So how does that fit into that agreement? Will the agreement be maintained? What happens if it's not? And how do the federal and provincial governments navigate that, do you think?
Harry, you want to take that one?
Just a small question. Thanks so much for that, Josh. I don't think that the draft plan as proposed meets the agreed upon outcomes for caribou recovery under the Section 11 agreement. The intent of that agreement was to recover caribou populations, and with the proposed timber harvest and other increases in disturbance in their range, I just don't see how that's possible with this draft. I don't think it's going to meet the agreement. That Section 11 agreement, I believe, is set to end at the end of 2025. And I can't speak to what either provincially or federally the governments will do on that, which I do think, again, as I mentioned, is a huge lost opportunity, because the result of inaction through the sub-regional plan or from the federal government is going to be that we lose these animals from the landscape, possibly forever. Kirby, did you have anything to add?
I think that covers it, Tara. We can't speak for the federal or provincial government, but the agreement ends at the end of the year, and as we mentioned, there's only 2 of the 11 plans that have been completed, and then this is the 3rd one that's out for review. And the Burland sub-regional plan was initiated, and the planning team finished their recommendations in 2023, and there's yet to be an announcement in terms of that draft plan being released. So they're way behind, and this latest plan doesn't achieve what the Section 11 agreement asked them to do.
Thanks, Kirby. Next question is from Melanie Dickey. She asks, what is your best case but still realistic outcome for the sub-regional plan?
I can take that if you'd like. Thanks, Melanie. I think that's a question that just is the basis of all caribou planning. In this case, I would like to see a new option that actually does achieve the caribou habitat requirements, preferably sooner than the next 100 years. I do think it's possible. As a member of the task force, we had the opportunity to discuss that, and I think that there are other forest harvest scenarios that could and should be explored, and I think that there are some more aggressive management options for the remaining types of disturbance on the landscape from roads, from well sites, etc. I think the scenario that we saw in this draft sub-regional plan is the worst case scenario, and I really feel like they could go back to the drawing board and come up with something better.
And I'd like to add to that if I could. We were told by the government that the trend for the oil and gas fields is actually away from the Caribou Range, not more into it. And so I think the oil and gas part of the equation can be managed with directional drilling and reducing the expectations of how many roads and that type of thing. In terms of the timber harvest, though, the Fish and Wildlife had basically been in a position of controlled retreat, keeping the cutting to the edges of the range for the last 20 or 30 years. And I don't think there's any room left in there for more timber harvest other than on the periphery and maybe at a very low level. The annual level cut that's set for the mill is in order to achieve continued forest removal. If you can grow the trees fast enough, you can cut them at the same rate, but it doesn't account for the other forest values. And so it's not sustainable forest management. It's simply sustained forest removal. And so I think if there was a reduction in the annual level cut, and certainly with a fire or anything else that occurs, it's happened south of Edson here, where 50%, I think, of the West Fraser FMA based out of Edson was burnt 2 years ago. So, that has to be adaptable. And I think doing that, we're obviously going to have to probably rely on wolf control for a number of years until the forest grows back up. But this plan simply suggests you're going to have to rely on wolf control for the next 100 years. And that's not socially acceptable, I don't think.
Thank you both. Next question from Stan Buden. He asks, even if you were to have all harvesting stop right now, so all logging stop, recovery to 65% undisturbed will still take 20 to 30 years. So how do you propose keeping caribou around during that time? Maybe that's one for Kirby.
Well, Stan has authored a number of papers suggesting that you need to do everything. You need to allow the forest to regrow. You need to keep predator-prey in balance by having wolf control until the number of alternate prey is reduced through age of timber. You can harvest alternate prey at a higher rate. And incidentally, this last year, the number of cow moose tags or antlerless moose tags that were in the WMU 355, I believe it is, was reduced by 75%. So not even that part of the equation has been kept up in terms of the government's approach. But the oil and gas development, like I say, with new technology, I think combined with the restoration of legacy lines, but the legacy seismic line restoration, in my mind, was still going to take 20 or 30 years to provide benefit as well. So yeah, it's a long game, but I think it's achievable. But it's going to have to be, well, perhaps even a penning program if things get worse. But the examples over in British Columbia where all of the management handles are drawn down seems to have some hope. They've certainly, the mobility herd has increased, I think, by 2 or 3 fold. But it's a societal decision, and everybody in society has to buy in.
Thanks, Kirby. Yeah. Next question is from John Carpenter, and he asks, has there been a study as to what area or amount of boreal forest needed for sustainable industry harvest and where that might occur to protect environmental/caribou concerns? And if not, any sense of why? So maybe put that to Tara in the context of the recovery strategies and 65% and other studies.
Thanks for that question, John. I guess it's quite clear what amount could be harvested to meet caribou habitat outcomes for creating self-sustaining caribou populations. But I wonder here if you're asking, you have sustainable in quote, and is that sustainable for industry? And to answer that question, I believe yes. Throughout the entire planning process that both Kirby and I participated in, there were also socioeconomic consultants providing that type of, again, economic analysis on the impacts of different scenarios throughout the plan. I haven't actually seen any of those, but I am aware that they do exist and were to inform some of the outcomes of the plan. So this is going to be an unsatisfactory answer, but I do think that if you're interested in that information, you'd have to ask the planning team.
Anything to add on that, Kirby?
No, I think that's all I would have to say as well.
The next question is a big one. So for both of you, from Don McGarvey, and he asks, without meaning to sound cynical, the overriding philosophy of the draft plan is the economy. What, if anything, can be done to change the government's focus to ensure that the short-term economic benefit of forestry, etc., in the region becomes subservient to the long-term environmental sustainability of the region, including the southern mountain caribou herds in question?
I struggled my whole career to try and come up with that answer. and why wouldn't one be cynical? I'm not sure the right answer. You can see that most lobbying that occurs to the government is based on the economy. It's, we need jobs, we need high-paying jobs, we need to be able to compete against other industries in other provinces or in the US. The irony I see in this is that Weyerhaeuser is an American company. They've lobbied the US government to put tariffs on Canadian softwood, and yet they operate in Alberta in their Canadian arm and are asking to log the last winter range of these two caribou herds populations. It's just ironic that Albertans and Canadians would accept that, in my mind. The problem is caribou don't have a voice at the table other than, rabble rousers like ourselves, I guess. And so if, you're a politician and you're continually lobbied by economic interests, then that's the song you dance to, I guess. However, we know that Canadians and Albertans value wildlife and value wild areas. Something like 75 or 80%, depending on what questionnaire you look at. We have caribou on our quarter, so. But there's no quick answer to that, and I'm not an economist, and I'm not a political scientist, so there's a bigger audience that we're going to have to address, I guess. And I guess information is about the only thing we have as a strategy right now, and trying to get the word out to as many people and make it clear, because the process that was part of public engagement, which was open houses, webinars, and these online surveys, so far maybe have only attracted 750 people out of a total of, I think we're coming up to 5 million people in Alberta. So it's not in everybody's daily to-do list, and most people have lots of other things they worried about. But in the back of their minds, I think they still hope that the government is going to provide the necessary management and conservation to have all species on the landscape. And it's in the Fish and Wildlife policy. It's part of the government's policy, but they tend to ignore it when there's dollar signs in front of it.
I guess I would just add to that, these ministerially appointed task forces were created as like a multi-stakeholder forum for input and recommendations to this draft plan. And I sat on the one for the Upper Smoky Sub-Region. And at that time, it was very clear that caribou recovery was an objective of the entire exercise and the land use planning. Not to say that it was the only objective, because again, sub-regional land use plan is this big planning opportunity for all sorts of land uses, including the persistence of wildlife. what shocked me and was the most disappointing in the release of this plan was the erasure of caribou and caribou survival and recovery as an objective of the sub-regional plan. So disappointing, but I think also provides a little bit of hope in that it was not too long ago an objective of the plan. And there was agreement that caribou habitat goals would be met as part of that. That was a consensus recommendation from the task force. So I do think it can change. But at this time, all I can say is raise your voice. Like, yeah, provide feedback. It's in draft. Perhaps it can change.
Thanks, Tara.
I
That's a
think-
great, great place to end it. I think that's about what you're gonna say. Eh? I'll let you wrap up.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we have run out of time, and I really appreciate everyone's attendance here. As I mentioned, this plan is in draft. Our biggest goal right now as an environmental conservation organization is just hoping to provide as much feedback as possible so that we can change this draft plan, and so that we can get good outcomes for caribou. Again, a lot of gratitude for everyone engaging and showing up today during your lunch hour. You can get in touch. I think all of the links were sent in the chat, and you can get in touch with us via email or online through our website if you have any more questions. Again, so much gratitude. This was recorded, and we will be posting it to our YouTube channels as well after, and as well the Alberta Chapter of the Wildlife Society will have access to the recording and will share with those participants that came via that way. So with that, everyone, thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much to Kirby for presenting as well today. Have a great afternoon.
Give caribou a voice.
Yeah, thanks. That's perfect, Karen. Bye, everybody.